what would it take for them to change? I'm Melissa Skaya, the Executive Director here at Domestic Intervention Programs. You should also be seeing, if you have a webcam, Scott Miller. So we're going to be doing a video conference today. We have some new technology we're testing out. So we're doing it free with you all today and testing it. So we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions below on the bottom, and Scott and I will go back and forth to answer some of those. And we should have posted up the PowerPoint and then two documents for you to view and look at. So one thing you should all know is that we're trying to be in this process and the learning process of all of you, so we appreciate your feedback going forward about this as we do this video conference. So we look forward to hearing your feedback about how this goes for you today as we use this technology for the first time. So we're going to start here today and start our PowerPoint, and Scott Miller is going to start with us today by giving a short introduction today about the Duluth Model and about how we use this tool that we've adapted for this video conference in men's group. So that's how we're going to begin today. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, how are you? Good. All right, so let's advance the slide. So we're going to start with is just how we organize in Duluth. So the model that we work with, although the model has been kind of defined a lot of different ways, the way that we think about it here in Duluth is that it's a way to organize. And one of the ways in which it organizes is to always link the problem of battering to the social influences that inform it and the historical nature of it. So it talks about creating these distinctive forms of organized public responses. That first bullet there, clearly identified and largely shared assumptions and theories about the source of battering and the effect it means to deter it. That piece is a really critical component of the organizing. If you've got law enforcement thinking one way about this, like say it's a relationship problem, then you've got prosecutors who really think that, you know, for example, men who batter need to be responsible to stop their violence, and then you got probation. They're thinking that this is about alcohol consumption, and then you get to a men's program and they're thinking about it in a different way. That will create a situation where it makes it difficult to not only organize a consistent response to this, but also organize a consistent message, both to offenders and victims. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because really the core of this is about this particular tool, but just know that the Duluth model links itself as an organizing method to every single agency that is a part of your coordinated community response, from 911 all the way to community advocacy and men's programs. Next slide, please. So these are the core principles of social change that we work with, and again, you're going to see this reflected in the tool that we're going to talk about. Create an experience that is liberating rather than dominating. So in this particular instance, we're talking about sitting down with a victim and having a conversation about why he's abusive to her. And you know, a dominating method would be to sit down and tell her why. And get her to believe a certain thing or a certain way about, in this example, men who batter. But what our model informs us to do is to sit down with her and learn from her about what her experience is, ask questions, and find a way to help her liberate herself from basically the oppression that she's been experiencing. So you know that part of being oppressed, you take on the thinking of the oppressor. And to get out from underneath that oppression, you have to have the space to both reflect and talk about your experience and find your way out, as opposed to us thinking like we're facilitators of a men's group or a women's group, that somehow the liberation resides in us and it's a gift we bestow upon them. Our belief is that the keys to everyone's liberation is inside them, and we facilitate a conversation where they find that. So that leads to the second one, which is engage in dialogue versus counsel and advise. We have a particular way of thinking about dialogue. Again, we won't spend a lot of time on that today, but it's an exchange. It's what I know, it's what they know, and how we combine what we know together to learn something new, both of us as teacher learners toward one another, as opposed to counseling and advising women as to what they should think, the theory that they should have in their head about what's going on, so on and so forth. Approach this as a social problem versus a problem with an individual. So again, you're going to see this reflected in the tool. The social problem that, I mean, there's the individual man who is committing the act of violence against this individual woman, but there's a whole piece of social construction that this man has grown up in that has informed how he thinks about himself as a man in relationship with a woman and what he gets to do because of that. So if she doesn't submit to what I want, then I have a right to punish her for not submitting. That's a learned bias, like racism would be, homophobia would be, sexism is. So if you want to liberate yourself from a form of oppression, you have to be linked to the larger messages that are available, telling you, if you're a man who's battering, justifying why you're doing what you're doing, and telling you that you have this right to control your partner. Include those subject to the oppression in the organizing. It's another essential piece of the Duluth model. So when we're creating a police intervention or a probation intervention like field visits to probationers, arrest policies, 911 policies, we're always going back to women and asking them, what's been your experience thus far? How would you change it? What would, if you had the power to design a 911 response, what would it look like? And we use that information to go back to 911 and organize a particular kind of response that's designed in a victim-centered way for those they're trying to serve. And again, you'll see this reflected in the tool. So just as a way to visually represent this, the Duluth model approach is how we organize. And in this particular instance, we're organizing a criminal justice response, criminal and community response to domestic violence. So that coordinated community response is what we organize. How we organize the CCR is the model that I've just been speaking of. And then we have the individual agencies who are members of that particular CCR. So what we're trying to answer, the answer to the question here is really when women who are battered come either initially as individuals to a advocacy organization or women in a women's group, there's often this question about why does he do what he does? It's hard for them to wrap their head around what motivates him to be as abusive as he is, to make the demands that he does. I did a focus group with a group of women who are in prison, mostly for drug use, but they all had been in relationships where living with abusive men, and that was the first question they had. Why does he do what he does? Why doesn't he stop? Why can't he see what he's doing to me? Those are all real questions, and sometimes it's difficult when you don't understand men who batter in depth to be able to convey that why he, basically to answer the question why he does what he does. So that's what we're going to try and answer today with this particular tool. So when you look at our men's nonviolence curriculum, these are the different themes, and each of these themes have a corresponding tactic that goes with them. So if you're, for example, if you're doing the tactic of respect, then the following class would typically be on emotional abuse. Those two things, respect is where we hope that the men choose to go, and emotional abuse is what they've been doing to their partner, and understanding both. And the way that we do that is using a control log, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But we're taking some of the work that we've done in this curriculum and adapting it to help women understand why men batter. So the power and control wheel is a visual representation of the lived experience of women who are battered. Now, all the tactics on that wheel, all women don't experience, and there are tactics that aren't on the wheel, so it's not all inclusive. However, it was put together by interviewing many battered women over the course of time and asking them the question, when you're living with a man who batters you, what's that experience? How does he get his way? What are all the different tactics he uses to get you to submit to what he wants? And what they talked about are these tactics on this wheel that are held together by the physical and sexual violence that is either a threat that they in their hearts believe will happen, or things that he has done. So if you look at emotional abuse again, for example, in that particular wheel, emotional abuse is something that many of us in nonviolent relationships have used with our partners, people we care about. However, what makes it different inside this wheel is that when you have physical and sexual violence on the outside, it changes how that emotional abuse plays out. So if one person comes into the home and dictates to their partner, because they can, that there's no more, that they're not going to do any more household chores, that all the household chores are going to be the responsibility of the other person, and there's no violence, there's probably going to be a fairly lengthy conversation about that decision. However, if person comes in and does that and has beat his partner the week prior, she's going to take that up in a very different way. Is she going to resist it? Is she going to submit to it? Is she going to try and find a way out of the relationship? Those are basically the choices that she has, working with somebody who's going to use violence to get her to submit. So this power and control wheel helps us understand that lived experience that women who are battered have. So we have a lot of tools in our men's nonviolence curriculum. The tool that we're going to focus on today is the control log. And if you will go to the next slide. The control log is a tool where there's a lot of tools in the curriculum, but the one that's really essential to use on a fairly regular basis is this particular log. It helps men critically think about and break down their abusive behavior. So what did you do? When you did it, what was the intent? What do you have to believe to think that when your partner does that, you get to do this? And then what's the effect on you? What's the effect on your kids? What's the effect on other people when you do these things? So that they can start critically thinking about the scope of what they're doing. And what men often say is, you know, I had no idea that when I called her a bitch, that there's all this other stuff going on. And, you know, men who batter often see their abuse in incidences. They don't see how their abuse is tied together over time and contextual, which is what her experience is. So even when he's being kind, for example, the violence or his potential violence never leaves his side. It's always a component of the decisions that she has to make given what she's up against. So we have found this to be a really effective tool to help men start thinking about why am I being abusive? What's driving it? What are the beliefs that inform it? And then if I want to stop doing it, what are the things that I'm going to have to replace those beliefs with? And that would be the equality log. So this whole notion of a log is a core aspect of our work with men who batter to, again, help them liberate themselves from what they've been socially constructed to believe. Next slide. That's a picture of the control log. You're gonna get a PDF coming up here that's more detailed here. We'll just move on from here. Okay, so Melissa Sky is going to take over from here. So
before we do, though, you're going to have to repeat the question, but somebody wants to know, can you say something about the research of the effectiveness of the Duluth model?
Sure.
Repeat the question. Beginning.
I'm sorry.
You need to answer the question. They want you to answer the question.
The effectiveness of the Duluth model,
yeah,
right?
That's one of the questions that came up.
Okay, so maybe what I'll do is is there a way to get a slide up?
Yes, we'll have to do that.
Okay, so while Melissa's presenting, I will get a slide up that has some of that on it that we don't have included in this particular slideshow before we end today. So,
okay.
All right.
That's all the questions we can. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you for taking the time with us again. I've been the person answering a number of the questions below. Now, Scott will take the time to do that. And so I just want to say that part of, the fun of doing this is that this is our first time using the video conference feature. So we had someone say, boy, Melissa looks a little intense there. Is she unhappy? And so just so you know, I can't see myself because I have the PowerPoint on here. So you feel free to let Scott know if I look unhappy because we're actually sitting in the same room. But thank you to the person who said that because I don't want to look intense and unhappy. I'm actually quite happy because I'm excited about this video conference. So going forward. But Scott will take your questions now below. So we wanted to say, Scott said a little bit about this already, but in part what we're saying here is that what we've done, as Scott said, is we've taken that control log and adapted it. And this came from, because I started out in this work in the Battered Women's Movement doing work with battered women directly for a number of years. And those questions did come up. And I just heard from battered women kind of a fair amount. They would say things like, he just promises he'll stop. He's not going to do it anymore. He's not going to drink anymore, for example. And so we're going to kind of talk about how when I started doing men's group and then training on our process here in Duluth about the men's nonviolence program, I started to see this way in which we could sort of take the learning and thinking that we have when we work with men who batter and use that for working with women to better help them understand our work. So just give you one example. We did what's called a safety and accountability audit with Praxis International out of St. Paul, and I believe they call it community assessment now. But when we were doing those, and we did one of our advocacy program, in particular our advocacy response in criminal cases. And one of the things that we learned early on, and it's part of our process here, is that the first 72 hours that after an arrest was kind of this really critical time that we had with battered women. And so when we looked at that and had that time, we said, well, what is it the things that battered women are asking us, that they're talking with us about? And this was a big thing that was coming up sort of all along is, will he change, can he change, and how does that happen? So I want to say that what we've done here in the handouts that we've given you is that we have taken our men's control log and we've made an adaptation. And that adaptation is one that we've tested here locally and throughout a number of places in Minnesota. I've tested out with battered women. But, we're a learning community, and so we would really appreciate your feedback and the input that you would have. For those who are on here, we welcome you to copy it and use it and try it out with battered women that you work with. We would ask that you just give us credit for that, but we provide tools to move the work forward, and so we want to hear from you about its efficacy and how well it works when working with battered women. So one of the things I've done is that I've taken I put one in here that was an example of a woman named Lisa that I did. I have another one, a woman is called Patty, and I think it's probably best if I sort of walk through and sort of talk through what it is and kind of how we used it. So assuming this works, I'm going to pull this up here for a second. See everything on my computer here for just a second. So Scott, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So what you see here on this page is you see this is kind of the log. Now, you know, one of the things about making these logs is that this was kind of many pages, but you know, we can change the font and the lines. But for the sake of this, we kind of made it a little bit bigger. But I also just want to say that in part what we've done is that when we tested it out with battered women and advocates and using it, we used language that was useful. And so one of the things that we kind of had a lot of question and debate about was how to title it. And so we ended up calling it A Log for Understanding Your Partner's Hurtful and Abusive Actions. And so, you know, hurtful was a word that kind of kept coming up. It was one that resonated with a lot of battered women when we asked them. We had just abusive before, and women said, no, women won't, that's not one that will resonate. And so this is still, as we said, a work in progress. But this is kind of the log you'll see here. I am going to move to the other one as an example, but I just want to point out on this one, what we put on the bottom of it is that I had made a guide to kind of how to think about it, and so I'll refer back to this one in just a few minutes. But we have the example here of Lisa, so I'm going to pull up Lisa's example and kind of talk about how when Scott and I talked with Lisa. So Lisa is a real woman that Scott and I met with and talked with. Lisa's not her real name. You should know, and we made a few adaptations just for her own sake. But to talk about this and kind of the purpose and where you would use it first, I want to point out that our thinking in part is that you would utilize this tool in kind of 3 different ways. You could utilize this one-on-one with battered women, and you would have to decide when and how and where that would be. So we're not going to make some suggestions to you about, you know, use it the 5th time or, you know, the 10th time or whatever. That you're going to know when you're talking with her when it's useful. But the thing about it is that even though it's on a form, we don't have this thinking that you're going to just give women a piece of paper. It's not meant for homework. You know, kind of when Scott was talking, it's really, really important to us that, you know, we don't want people to take the tools we use and have them become these sort of tools that then end up sort of dominating women's lives in a oppressive way. And, you know, I only say that because I've worked with the Advocacy Learning Center with Praxis International for a number of years. And, you know, unfortunately, some of the things that we've heard is that sometimes what happens when tools come out is that these tools get utilized to make women do things or make them see things, and I don't think that's the intention, but what battered women tell us is that's inherently what ends up happening. And so we just want to be really clear that this is not something that, you know, should ever be utilized in that sort of way. When it's part of a liberation process, it's helped to engage battered women in a critical thinking process about what's happened in their lives, not to have be as homework or an assignment or as part of the process, for example, to get their children back or something like that. So I say that because we provided the sheet that has the blanks on it, but really what we would like to see is that advocates get so familiar with it that it's the way in which they talk with battered women when they talk with them, so that they start to talk in terms of, well, tell me what he did, tell me what was his intent, what do you know about his thinking that justified it, the effects, and so on. We'll talk more about that, but I just want to kind of set the stage for this in that way, that that's kind of how this is set up for us. So if you take a look at actions, and so just to point out again, this could just come out in conversation or maybe a part of a process in a group or one-on-one with a woman. And so here what we had as an example is we had asked Lisa, so tell us about a situation or a time when Mike did something hurtful or abusive to you. And so Lisa had talked about a time when her and Mike were out with their friends one night. She ran into someone that she went to high school with. Mike didn't know the man, but she said this thing, you know, she could see kind of across the room that Mike was getting just really pissed off at her. And she said, you know, I ended the conversation with the man just real fast because I knew how he was going to react. And she said, he didn't talk to me, basically said, we're leaving. We get in the car, in her words, she said, he choked me, you know, or strangled me. And she said, he made this comment to me, I knew you were just another cheating bitch. And so part of what we're looking for here when we're sort of identifying is some real specific things. You know, what were some of the statements he made? What were some of the gestures? So the gesture was the look, you know, that she talked about, his tone of voice, physical violence, sexual violence. So we're really looking at what are the things that he did when he was abusive, and to identify some of those specifically. The next piece is this piece about intent. And the thing about intent is a way to think about it is, what did your partner want you to do or not do in this situation? And the reason why we found that this one was really, really helpful to use with battered women is because the thing about, as Scott was talking about, when, you know, when he is oppressing her, he wants her to take on his thinking. And what we found is that a lot of battered women were saying things like, well, you know, he just blew up. You know, he just gets really angry. You know, he gets out of control and he can't control himself. And so this one in particular, what we found is that it really helped women sort of see that his actions were tied to an intention. And the intention in this case with Lisa was to have, you know, in her words, to have me not talk to any other men and only pay attention to him. I mean, she just kind of knew that that was the message that he was sending to her when he was violent to her and said that to her in the car. And so we really sort of think about, you know, that action has an intention. And another way sort of to think about it is that our mentor, Ellen, had said this to us one time, to think about the use of violence. And when we say violence, I also want to say that we don't mean just physical violence, but to think about in a broader way. So if we think about that, every act of violence has an intent. And in a really, really simplistic way, it has the intent to get the other person to stop doing something or start doing something. And so to think about it now, it'd be another way sort of to word it with battered women if this is something maybe they're sort of struggling with to think about. But I will tell you, as a person who's kind of been testing out this way of talking with battered women to help them have a deeper understanding about why he's violent, in part what I found is that women come to the answer of this question of intention quite quickly because they know the message that comes with why he's being abusive and violent, that the intention piece was really fairly easy for them to understand. And so the intention one is a really, really important one. The other thing about the intent is that what we know is it kind of helps women see that there's a pattern often in the behavior when we look at action and intent. And so we sort of, we're real sort of conscious about talking about both of those and how they're tied together. The next one is beliefs. And so this is one I will say that, you know, it was a little bit of a challenge for us in terms of thinking about, so we went through a number of iterations about how to word this one here, in part because what we knew was that what he does is tied to the intention of what he wants to have be different, but is also tied to how he justifies it. And so the way in which we ended up wording it here is this way. So we say, the way we said it with Lisa, we said, well, what, you know, how would Mike justify his abusive actions? Now this next part, you know, if you've ever asked him, why did you do that to me? Now I want to just put a precursor there. We know we're not asking women to ask him, you know, why did you do that to me? But we did know from talking with battered women is a number of them at different times had some version of this question. Or if they hadn't asked them, they have thought about it themselves. They've thought, well, I want to, you know, sort of think, why does he do this to me? And then so then we would just say to battered women, well, how would he answer that? You know, how does he how is it that he justifies his hurtful and abusive actions towards you? And then we also sort of tied it to, we asked women, because it kept coming up in different ways over and over, is what's his thinking about the role of a woman in a relationship with a man? Because so many of the women had answers that were tied to that. And so when we asked Lisa this question, Lisa said, well, he would often say things like, you know, all women cheat. And he would remind me that I needed to stay in line in life and that I needed him to do that. So I know, and she said, if I'd asked him, you know, why, he'd just say, because, you know, you need to stay in line, it's my job to do it. But she also knew that he had this thing that all women who talk to other men eventually are going to cheat. And so she said, I wouldn't even have to ask him because he said that to me just in many different ways over time. And so that was one of the things that sort of came out with Lisa when we talked with her. The next piece is we said, so what, on the log, we'd say, what feelings or emotions did he have during this situation? And Lisa said, you know, I'd see a buildup of anger. He'd give me looks that scared me. And what she was talking about in particular is that when she would see him across the room, when she was talking to this other man, she's like, she literally could see it building up in him. And so she talked about that a number of times for herself. And that those are some of the feelings that resonated. But, you know, other women said, you know, frustrated, you know, angry, of course, was one that came up. Women said cold and calculated were other words that they used. And so we'll talk about in just a minute about how we think about feelings and about how they're tied to beliefs in just a second. But I just want to just keep going through this. And then we, next piece was minimization, denial, and blame. In what ways did your partner minimize or deny his hurtful and abusive actions towards you? Oh, I see that we have a little typo there. I'll have to change that. It's supposed to be a question mark on our log. Sorry about that. And how did we try to make this your fault, and did it work? Now, the interesting thing is when we have this conversation about fault and blame, we added this question on the end, and did it work? Because with a number of women, they just talked about that. You know, Lisa here said something about, you know, he minimized everything that I wanted to talk about. It just was always all my fault, and I just knew that. And she said, you know, what happened over time is I began to believe him, and, you know, and think I must have, you know, remembered it wrong. I'm sorry. She said I found myself apologizing. And so for me, she said, you know, when it happened over and over and over again, she said, you do just start to take on the thinking that it is your fault, you know, going forward. And that becomes part of what happens. The next piece is about effects or impact, and what was the impact of his actions from this situation and long term, and then on the children. So one of the things is that we wanted to have women sort of stick with specifically this situation and have them look at, you know, when he did this, so when he did this action of when, you know, he strangled you in the car, he, you know, said that awful thing to you, what was the impact on you through that situation? And you know, she had said, I couldn't breathe. He strangled me. You know, it was like 5 to 10 seconds. I couldn't breathe. My throat was really sore for quite a while, and I was scared. But then we also wanted to take about and have Lisa reflect a little bit about, you know, what's the long-term impact? And so we've kind of divided this up into 4 different ways: physically, emotionally, spiritually, and cognitively. So physically, the way in which she talked about it was, you know, I was panicking all the time. I actually felt shaky. I hear some echoing just for a second. There's unmuted. Is it? Okay. You sure? Sorry. Did you unmute on accident because it's echoing in my ear? Is it echoing? This is echoing. All right. Sorry about that. So we had terms of physically, emotionally, spiritually, and cognitively. And so what we had her do is think about it in that different way. And so she said, you know, I was panicking all the time. I couldn't eat. I was emotional. You know, I was crying all the time. Spiritually, is it echoing? Okay. And then cognitively. And I was so nervous around him all the time. And it was really hard, and I would just begin to forget things. And so we really wanted to think about these four different ways. And so the other thing that we wanted to do is that we wanted women to think about their children. And one of the interesting things we learned over time is that women said, you know, we would ask these questions about how is it affecting your children. And what would happen is that women would say, you know you're asking me about children, but for me, it is, each of my children. So what we learned is we want to ask about each of the children because we know, of course, that it's every child gets differently. And so, Lisa's situation, she talked about how it affected Kylie, she talked about how it affected Mary, she talked about how it affected Carrie. So Lisa had an older daughter and then she had twins. And so what we wanted to do is have her sort of identify it for herself. So the next piece is that we had, that's kind of the effect or impact. And so when we kind of look at all this up until this point right here, it's sort of really deconstructing sort of what happened. Now, part of it then is the question is, well, how does it end then, right? And so if we want Lisa to think about how does it change, well, part of it is that we want to think about what does Lisa think should be, what does she want to have him to be doing differently? And it's not this thing where we say, well, Lisa should decide how Mike should act differently. But in part what we're saying is that we have this idea, and kind of when we did our equality wheel, back in the 80s, women sort of created this vision about what they wanted their relationships to look like. And so here's the key piece then for us with Battered women is that we would say, well, just take Lisa's example. Well, I wanted him to come over and join in the conversation with me and my high school classmate. So, okay, so this is what you wanted him to do different. And so when we looked at the log, we said, okay, in the men's violence log, the way in which we talk about it, this is how we wanted him to act differently. So then the key question then is, what would his thinking, or his beliefs, how will they have to change in order for him to be non-abusive? What beliefs would he have to change about women in relationships, for example? So we're linking this idea. If this is how, we would want, men to be different, what would it take? And so women very easily could say, they had a number of answers, just give Lisa's one. Well, I know he'd have to think about women differently. She said he always had this thing that women don't know what they're supposed to do. And he would say it directly, but he would also say it indirectly all the time. And so for Lisa, it was when we talked with her, so we're not totally identifying, what his thinking would have to be different in terms of belief, but what she was able to do is to see that if he still carries with him forward the belief, all women cheat. Let's just say that was his, and this was, she very easily identified that with Mike. Then if she wants him to do something differently, I wanted him to come over and join in the conversation with a high school classmate. Well, a way to think about it then is this. So if we want him to do something differently, his thinking actually has to match up with that. And so that's where we see in our work, Scott and I do, where there's a real disconnect when people are doing what we would call skills work with men who batter. So just say a little bit more about that. We'll find a number of men's groups when we get asked to go and observe them, they'll be teaching men skills about how to do things differently or how to talk differently to women. And so the problem with that is that when we look at the log and the way it's used in the men's group, for example, is that if we teach them just actions and we don't have them look at the change in their beliefs, it's actually not even possible to happen. That their thinking is tied to why they act and how they act. And so, Scott, maybe if you'd be willing to kind of talk about that a little bit more, to kind of talk about how we talk about that with men in group, that'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, so, you could, if you use the example, a guy says, my wife and I, we fight a lot about money, and what I try to do is try to learn from what I learned and take what I learned in class, and I went home and we had this conversation about our budget, and I looked through the bills. So I did my part, I did the work, I looked through the bills, and I figured out there's a couple things that she's spending money on every month that we could, if we cut those out, we'd have extra at the end. And she got all pissed at me, and it went down in a bad way, and so the stuff wasn't working. Well, okay, so as a facilitator, I can say, well, hey, what you did is you told her you just picked her stuff out to get rid of and not your own, and that's what caused the problem, and she wasn't part of the solution, and all this kind of stuff. If this is a relationship without fear and violence, that might be a conversation to have. But when I sit down with this individual and say, well, here's the problem. Let's practice how you'd open up a conversation about the budget in a way that would allow space for your partner and space for you to come to a mutual decision about what's going to happen. And if you can't come to a mutual decision, how you can agree to disagree and prioritize the relationship over getting your way, right? We could do all that stuff with him. But if he believes that, like in this case, that women don't know what to do, right? That's just a fundamental belief. Or as I talked to a guy yesterday, he said, I'm 34, she's 28. And he said, in my head, she doesn't have a life experience that I do. And so when she tells me things, I always have to figure out if it's really going to be the right thing to do, because I don't trust her thinking, right? So you get a guy who has these beliefs about somehow she's defective because she's too young, she's defective because she's a woman and can't put things together. However that is, you give him a skill or teach him language and then expect that he's going to go home and replicate it because he doesn't believe that she's an equal. He doesn't believe in her thinking in this particular instance. The other piece of it is that you send this guy home to talk to a woman who he has beaten. He may have raped her, right? I mean, you don't know the extent to the violence that he's used to get her to submit or to punish her for not. So the resentment that she has, the fear that she has, the anger that she has is all a component of this that the skill doesn't take up. So you send Jim, for example, home to go talk to his partner about the budget, and she throws the checkbook in his face and says, fuck you, I don't want anything to do with this conversation, and leaves. He comes back to the men's group and says, well, you see, I'm doing it right, but the problem is really her, right? Because she's not. That's the problem with the skill stuff. If you change the thinking, if he changes the thinking in his head about what he gets to do and who he is in that relationship, he will do these things. We see it all the time in men's group. Things that men have done with their partners, with their kids, that we haven't taught them. But they've changed how they think about their role as a man in that home, which changes, again, how they end up interacting with their partners. So kind of a quick little explanation of why we don't do that skill stuff in men's group.
Can you tie it a little bit back to men's past use of violence? And they can't hear me, so just reiterate.
Okay, so yeah, Melissa just asked me about past use of violence. So again, what I talked about is that she remembers all the things that he's done to her when she hasn't done what he's dictated. So he's slapped her, he's spit on her, he's humiliated her in public. There's all these punishments that he has doled out against her. When guys are starting to change and become safer to be around, she begins to let him know that all the resentments that she holds, she might start communicating those rather loudly in his direction. And the guys will often experience this when they begin to change, when they become safer, because now he's not doing a lot of the things, he's not as scary as he used to be, and the women start talking to him about what it's been like to live with him. And that past use of violence is an important component to keep in our heads as facilitators of men's group, because although he doesn't carry his past use of violence in his head when he's interacting with his partner necessarily, His partner absolutely does. She doesn't forget what he's done. And it's always an equation for her. So when we develop interventions that, like a skill, teaching skills to, to men in class, if we don't think about that reality for her as we develop an intervention, then she gets lost in the process. It's no longer victim-centered. It's more about offender-centered change than victim-centered safety. So that past use of violence is critical.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. So, all right, so I'm unmuted now. Okay, sorry about that. So another one I just want to share with you a little bit is one that we had done with a woman named Patty. And so just to give an example, I just want to say, the power of doing this, having done this now a number of times with Battered women, is that I remember the very, very first time I had done this, and I talked with a woman. I was mentoring a new advocate and was using this process. And so in part what had happened is I had just written the belief on a Post-it note, and this is kind of how this all came to be, and I had set it on the table. And the battered woman and I were talking about a number of other things. And then she said, I need to stop you for a second. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, what I need to do, she said, is that I'm coming to realize that if he doesn't change that thinking, then it's never going to change. And that's kind of when I had this moment, of that this sort of way of understanding it was really, really helpful to her. And so what I had written down on a piece of paper, it was a time where she had paid, they were married, she had paid a bill late in their house. And so she was kind of worried every day, was the late bill going to come, who was going to see it, who was going to find it. And so what happened then is that, of course, the one day she didn't, she didn't get it in time, is the way she kind of described it. And what happened then, she said, is for her, is that she essentially said, I just knew. She just said, and she said, he opened it up, she took it, and she said, I was sitting at the kitchen table. She goes, and he had it in his hand, and he hit me upside the back of the head with it. I mean, she said really hard, and said, called her a name, and said, you can't even balance the effing checkbook. You're so stupid. And it's kind of the way in which she talked about it. And so she said, he has this thing about that women just are no good with money. And so I just wrote that thinking on the Post-it note and set it on the table. And so it was just kind of one of those moments where then I started examining with women about what they understood about what his thinking was about her. And the thing is, I will say sometimes about the beliefs that men who batter will share is that a lot of them are commonly held beliefs along for a number of people in relationships. But the difference is that the thinking of that, it's how he justifies what he gets to do to her. And so it's a really, really important distinction to make. I want to just give this example here of when I did this one with Patty. And so, Scott, can you see it on the screen, or is it hard to see? Okay, great. So we didn't share this one here. We can, but the reason why when I did this one I want to share it is because the thing that Patty had said is that her partner was one that had used a lot of alcohol. And so it was also another example of what sort of comes up sort of over and over and over again with a number of battered women. Is they'll say things like, if he just stops drinking, if he doesn't drink anymore, then this is what will happen. He will, if he stops drinking, he'll stop being abusive. And when I did this with this exercise with Patty, I mean, it's not her real name, but she's just so bright, and she just said that, she said, I will tell you though, the thing that I knew, she said, is that I knew that his thinking wasn't any different when he was drinking or not. She goes, his violence was a lot worse, but the thinking was always there. And so just to go over a little bit about with her, and I'll do a little bit more briefly here for the sake, but she talked about, it was a Wednesday night. She said, I was going to a night church service, and she said he didn't want to go, and she said, she was leaving. She said, I got as far as the garage door. She said, I didn't even know he was behind me. And she said, you know, and she said, in my mind, she said, we weren't even arguing that day, right? And she said, in her mind, things were pretty good that day. And she said, what happened was he came up behind her and grabbed her in the back of the jacket and then dragged her back into the house. And she said, he just threw her into the chair. And she said, he was screaming at her, something to the effect of, you know, you just think you get to do whatever you want. And she said he was a really, really strong guy, she said. She said he actually, she was sitting in the chair. He picked up the chair with her in it and threw her in the chair, but he's holding the chair, threw it into the middle of the room, and her back ended up hitting part of the chair, and a really hard part of the chair. And so she ended up getting a bruise and injured on her back as a result of it. And so when I asked her, I said, you know, what did he want you to do? And we'll just call him Kurt. And she said, well, she said, I knew he didn't want me to go anywhere. It was very clear. He told me that. And she said, he especially didn't want me to be around my friends, and he didn't want me to be at church. And it wasn't necessarily like not be with friends and not be at church. It was more sort of this idea of you don't just get to go wherever you want, you know, that you get that your role is here with me. And so when we, and I think that this one is a really good example in part because what we find is that, you know, Patty could have easily said, you know, I mean, literally she's just walking out the door, all of a sudden, you know, she could very easily sort of take on this thinking of, you know, all of a sudden he just like blew up, you know, because in her mind it was a pretty good day. But when she was asked, she really clearly knew, she said, it was because he just wanted to keep me there. And so when he said, well, how would Kurt justify, you know, his actions? Or, you know, have you ever thought about, you know, why did he do that to me? Or, you know, if we asked you that, you know, how would you answer that? How do you think that he justifies what he does to you? And so when we asked her and talked to her, you know, about that, essentially, you know, she said, just kind of moving the screen here a little bit, she said, he always kind of felt like, she said, that he was above me and that he was kind of above everyone else. And so she said, what was really, really, you know, she said, is that, can you see it better that way, Scott? Can you see it all right? No. Okay. She would say, what he would sort of say to that is, you know, he always felt like he was above everyone else. She said, especially the woman he was in a relationship with. And she said he would always do this thing like imply I didn't love him enough and then I fell short of what a wife should be in a relationship. And she said that, you know, but she said, I knew that he had this thinking it was about me, but I also knew that she said, I know this now, she said, but I didn't know it at the time. She said, I thought it was all me, that I wasn't fulfilling my obligations. I wasn't doing what I needed to do as a wife. So I was constantly like trying just to meet his needs. And she said, I spent so much energy trying to meet his needs. And so when we did this with Patty and other women, one of the things that became really, really clear about doing this sort of process in this way is that women started just to sort of voice, they said, you know, the thing I'm sort of seeing right now, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that he would do this with any woman, that it's not just me. And so this process, what we found was really, really helpful to women to depersonalize it to them, that they weren't defective, and because that's what Kurt wanted Patty to see in particular. She's defective, she needs to do things differently. And so when we looked at feelings with Patty, she said it was an incredible amount of anger. He just flies off the handle. And she said, especially when he was drinking. When we looked at sort of minimize, deny, and blame with her, you know, one of the things that she said right here, I'm just sort of highlighting this just so you can see it a little bit better. But one of the things she said is that he had this thing of that you just twist things. She said, he also told me that I did not love him enough. You know, this is a quote from her. And she said, you know, for her, she said, I mean, she said, I actually just felt like, I mean, like he would even just do this thing of like, it didn't even happen. You know, that the incidents didn't even happen. When we sort of asked her also, you know, how would he minimize it? And she said sometimes he would use blackouts as an excuse sometimes, but she also just said, he would say to her, you know, you're just crazy. How can you even think that way of your husband? Because it didn't happen that way. And so when we looked at her sort of, you know, over time and how it impacted her, one of the things, you know, she said part of the impact on her, she said, I had a bruise on my back. She said that night I didn't go to church. She said, and part of the long-term impact on her, she just said, I just became burdened by his unhappiness. She said when he'd come home, she said, I'd actually start shaking. And she was also a woman who very interesting. She had 2 children, and she talked about the very distinct differences between her 2 children. She said that when her son was young and in grade school, she said he cried every day in grade school. He was very kind of an emotional wreck often. And then Kara, the daughter, it was different for her. She said what happened, she said, I became everything to her, and he didn't feel safe. She didn't feel safe around her dad, and she became a very, very cautious child. And so part of it is that just to think then when we said to her, you know, if the situation came up again, what would have to be done differently? And she said, I would have wanted him to go to church with me, right? And so when we sort of asked her, well, what would be the thinking that he would have to have in order to do that? You know, part of what she said sort of is that, you know, what I just sort of knew is that he didn't see me as a partner. You know, that this idea of like we're in a 50-50 sort of partnership, she just said that just didn't exist. You know, she just said he'd have to see his role differently, but she said he never saw us as equals, she said, and I knew that. And so, you know, for her then sort of tying it back to the beliefs, that's just kind of, you know, one of the things that then gets opened up for women is that unless this changes, he's not going to be able to do these non-controlling actions and behaviors. That essentially, that if he keeps the thinking, right, that's here, this is what'll keep happening. And so it's a way in which for us to think about it. And what we knew, like I said with Patty, is that he always sort of blamed his drinking on it, or his violence on the drinking. And she said, you know, it was worse. And she said, I'm not going to say to you that if he stopped drinking, it wouldn't have been better. Yes, it would have been better. But I'm telling you that he still would have been abusive, hurtful, mean, and violent to me. And so it really sort of helped her sort of distinguish when we sort of think about all the theories that are out there. You know, if we kind of just think about that a little bit, you know, what we know sort of over time is that there's a lot of sort of different theories out there about, you know, why men are violent towards women and why and what sort of interventions work. And the thing that we know is that what you think the cause of the violence is going to lead you to a particular intervention, right? So, I mean, just to take Patty and Kurt, for example, you know, there are a number of people who think, you know, that he needed to be re-engaged or reconnected with his spiritual self. And so often what that intervention will say or bring is say that, you know, he needs to go to church more, he needs to pray more, or something to that effect, right? And so we would ask, how is that then going to change his thinking? You know, will that process do that? You know, we have to ask ourselves that question is, will that intervention do that when we look at each and every one of those interventions? And so one of the things I'd like Scott just to talk about just for a couple minutes and sort of talk about is kind of this distinction, Scott, what we talk about in terms of having men think about and talk about. A lot of women will say, you know, he just needs to deal with his childhood. You know, he needs to deal with the trauma that he experienced, and kind of how we think about, you know, trauma work in the individual therapy and this process we're talking about in men's group that we've adapted here for working with battered women.
Okay. So probably the most efficient way for me to communicate this would be to just use my example. So I grew up in a home with violence, and I also was sexually abused by 2 different men outside my family. And So you can imagine growing up, I had a lot of different issues. I didn't trust anybody. Growing up into a young adult, my relationships were, they would come, they would go, and I didn't have any way of understanding how to link what I had experienced as a child to the kind of decisions and choices I was making as an adult. And so, long story short, I end up in therapy in my late 20s, and I start working on this trauma that I had experienced as a child for many years. And that work was essential for me, even just being here today, to help walk me back through all of those different experiences that I had so that I could really own them in a different way. That abuse had carved out a particular person that was, in my way of thinking about it, not who I was born to be. And I wanted, there was a particular kind of man I wanted to be. So, that was a life-saving process for me. But the limitation of it was that when I started a relationship post-therapy with a woman, she would, her decision, we would kind of split up the chores, and her decision was that she wanted to buy the groceries, and my thing was to pick at her choices about the groceries, like, why did you buy this? We already have some. You've got too much of this. We're not going to make that this week, so we don't, all that kind of stuff, just not directly telling her you don't know what you're doing, but absolutely communicating to her that I knew a lot more about grocery shopping than she did. Now that may seem odd, like, why would you pick that? That was just an outcome from my overall thinking that men know what to do and women don't. Now, I grew up in a house where I watched hundreds of examples of small privileges from what I chose to eat. I follow what my dad eats. My dad picks it, we pick it. If my mom picks it, we don't have to eat it. Kids change the channel. He doesn't get up and change the channel. We take his boots off. He doesn't take his boots off. All these things that I learned growing up in a home that didn't necessarily weren't violent or physical, but were entitlements that as a man he got. And I grew up with that stuff. And so the trauma work that I did, although it was essential for me to be in a relationship, now when I had to go through another process to deconstruct all the entitlements that I'd learned that men get when they are in a relationship with a woman, which was a very different process. So, the fact that I got my head around the sexual abuse and growing up with violence around me didn't help me when it came to what I've been socially constructed to do, what I've learned I get to do from growing up in that kind of an environment. So that's kind of how we think about those two processes, and one isn't, for me, one wouldn't be more important than the other. Both were essential for me to get to where I am today. So.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think that's important because when we get a lot of questions, comments, feedback from people about, the Duluth model. Is it trauma-informed? Does it deal with this childhood? Those sorts of things. A way in which we talk about with battered women is that for us, it's not either or. It's an and situation. And so we just want to make sure that people understand that we think that process is a separate process. Another way to think about it is that, to reiterate a little bit of what Scott's saying, is that people sort of men grow up and women grow up, sort of in a house and, in a world about how to sort of think about, the role of men and women in a relationship. We come to think that way. And, one of the things is that what happens is that a lot of these things become just what we sort of call, we put in here a truism, right? It's that this is the way sort of that it is. And so it's kind of a bit how we think about beliefs a little bit. And so just to go a little bit back to the guide, just to name a couple things about it, is that in part what we we see happening is that we want some of the beliefs challenges to sort of look at that a little bit, because discussing beliefs really sort of examines the societal and personal experience that shapes men's values and beliefs about men and women also for themselves. It's an opportunity for battered women's advocates to also talk with battered women about where's their thinking about that in terms of the beliefs and the thinking about the role of a man and a woman in a relationship. And so the one thing I just want to say also is that we want to just sort of see that this minimization, denial, and blame, I'll tell you, having talked with battered women about it, if, a lot of battered women say, this is the place where crazy making happens, where I just start to think am I actually crazy from this? And so the liberating process is that when we sort of, shape it in this way and frame it as it's minimization, denial, and blame, women, number one, said, he just says that, and I haven't even thought about it in this way, right? And so I was working with a woman who was exchanging her kids with him. She wasn't living with him anymore. And I said, well, one of the things to think about is just kind of start to listen for all the ways in which he minimizes what he's done, all the ways in which he denies what he's done or blames you for it, and just sort of really opened up for her some of the thinking. And so I want to say that part of our process, when Scott kind of talked about it in the beginning, was that, our process, we'll say in Duluth, is that we don't give out handouts or worksheets. We don't have a worksheet on the top 10 tips of a healthy relationship, because it's this sort of process. When we ask reflective questions to women and they find it within themselves, they see it in their own world, that's really the place of change that can happen, not in us, that we're not the experts on their lives, that we don't have the answers for them, and that this sort of liberation process is what can bring change. And so just to reiterate a couple of things, I know one of the things we want to kind of talk about is that somebody asked early on about the effectiveness of the Duluth model, and so we have a slide about that I'll pull up in just a second. But just to reiterate, one of the things here is that when we kind of look at here at the end, as we think about if this is what we would want him to do differently, so you take that word action, we want him to act in a different way, have non-abusive, non-violent behaviors. What's the thinking that he would have to have in order to actually do that? And just one last example, and I was observing a men's group, I saw the men's group, the facilitator said something to the effect of, what we're hearing from battered women is that you're really demanding, and that the battered women are saying they want you to request things instead of demand it. So they said, well, let's talk about all the ways in which we're demanding of our partners. So they made a whole list of all the demands that men battered, that they identified in themselves, essentially. And they said, well, okay, so let's talk about all the ways in which we can request things of our partner. So they have the men, they sort of help them along, sort of like, if I didn't want to do it this way, like, go get me this now, right? Or if you wanted to request it, how would you do it? And so what we saw sort of very clearly when we were observing group then is that that's where they stopped. Because essentially they would say, when we talked to them after, they said, well, we want to teach men skills on how to be, less aggressive and more assertive in how they communicate with women. Well, what we knew was that they were teaching in action, and they weren't having men examine the beliefs that they had that supported, or that were tied to them demanding their partners to do things. And they never had men examine and look at the thinking that it would take to have in order to do the request. So I just want to point that out as an example here of one of the ways in which we sort of think about those two being linked together. So I'm going to pull up the slide here about the effectiveness, and you can all see my email here for just a second, I guess, because Scott, you emailed it, right? So is that true, Scott? You emailed it?
That's true.
Okay, well, everybody gets to see my email here, so you can see it like Pottery Barn, apparently, I don't know. So, okay, here it is. I'll open up. Oh, no, this is Holiday Sparkle or something. Yeah, see? We'll see if we're able to get this to come through. Scott, I'm not.
You're not in the right.
Did you send it to the executive? Oh, there it is. Okay. So, because we like to please, we're going to pull up this slide here. And Scott, why don't you talk a little bit about this, and I'll mute myself before we end.
Okay, so yeah, this is just one slide since we don't have a lot of time left, but one of the things that we do to have ongoing evaluation of our model. Now, when I say, when the question was the effectiveness of the Duluth model, and obviously here in Duluth, so it's the effectiveness of the whole system we have organized. Well, we don't think about effectiveness of necessarily the police or the men's program when we think about recidivism. We're thinking about recidivism across the system. So when a guy comes into the system we've designed, starting with that law enforcement response, as far as contact with him, and he goes through into the men's program, what's the recidivism of that response on him? So we have a database that tracks all these different points of case processing. We can tell you what the average bail amount that well, we could tell you, but we probably wouldn't, the bail amount of each judge gives on a misdemeanor domestic assault, what the dismissal rate is for a prosecution office. We have that level of detail on each of these domestics, and all of them come to us. So, so we put these into a database, and what we did is we tracked, as you can see there from the slide, from January 1st, 1998 to December 31st, 1999, about 353 guys. Now, the recidivism gets defined as an arrest, a non-arrest. In other words, they went to the home. There wasn't probable cause to make an arrest, but somebody had claimed that some level of fear was involved that they called 911, and it was with their intimate partner. So we didn't. So it's a pretty generous way to think about recidivism. It would include a granted order for protection, also. So 29% of those 353 guys, whether they completed the men's program or not, ended up committing another offense within 8 years from their last point of contact. Now, recently, we pulled another 2 years from January 1st, 2004 to December 31st, 2005, 326 men in that particular group, and 34% overall recidivism. And when we broke it down this time between men who completed the program and men who did not, and when we looked at completers, those men were recidivated at 29%, and those who did not recidivate are recidivated at 41%. But when you combine all these numbers together for both years, it ends up being about 7 out of 10 guys processed by the coordinated community response that we've designed will end up back in the system 8 years from their last point of contact. Their partners, we would probably have a higher recidivism because we're just tracking re-entry back into the civil or criminal system. So, we understand the limitation of this, but that's an expensive way to track recidivism because of the database that we have and because of the access to data we have from the criminal justice system. This is a way we try to apples follow our effectiveness in the community. So I hope that helps and answers to some extent the question that was asked earlier.
Hey, thanks, Scott. I mean, one of the things too, I'd just say for people just sort of to look, and sort of compare is that, there is a difference, amongst, the ways in which other people sort of think about and talk about essentially what recidivism is. We're sharing you with ours. We encourage you to sort of look to see what that is, other studies that you'll find going forward. So we're past our time now, so we do want to end with you. We want to say that this is our first time doing this with a video conference. We hope that maybe it's helpful. I don't know, maybe not doing it with a video feed. We'll send you a survey to see if it's helpful going forward. So we had a grant that sort of paid for it now, but we're going to offer just a number of these. Our goal is going to be, a number of times throughout the year. They just give some examples of ones that will be coming up for you with a nominal fee going forward for those. So we encourage you to just continue to look at our website going forward, and then we'll have you stay engaged with us and give some feedback to us about what would be helpful. We have some resources here for you in terms of additional resources, and we'll put this up. This is being recorded. We'll put it up on our website, and then we'll also take the time to answer your questions. So we thank you for your time today and look forward to your feedback as part of a learning community. So have a great day. I hope I smiled enough for the person who said I was looking unhappy, because I am quite happy. So, but thank you for your time here today, and we hope this is useful. And we really do want to hear back from you. We're probably going to make some modifications to the tool that we created, and we'll make sure to put that up on our website for you all to take a look at and utilize. But we really do want to hear feedback from you about the usefulness of this tool. Thanks.